All right, let's see if we can finish up this video here, this playlist. Okay, so where did we leave off? We had square root of 121, which is the same thing as 121 to the power of 1/2, which is 11, because 11 times itself 2 times is 121. So notice the relationship we had up here. So finding a fourth root is the same thing as raising to the 1/4 power. Okay, so what times itself 4 times is equal to that number? Well, that's the same thing as just taking it to the 1/4 power. Finding the fifth root would be then the same thing as the 1/5 power. The sixth root is the 1/6 power, and so on and so forth. So finding the square root is actually the same thing as taking a number to the 1/2 power. We can often use that idea with a fractional exponent for a square root, but we certainly can. So you can do this for any root. So if we have to find what times itself, 10 times, if you have a really, really big tournament, let's say you've got more than 64 teams, let's say you got 128 teams. How many games would that take? So you are looking for something that has a very large number of times being multiplied by itself. You can use that idea of the nth root, and so that means that whatever your root is, let's just call it n, and x just stands for whatever number you have, but what times itself n times is equal to that number. Well, that's the same thing as taking it to the 1/n power. Oops. Let's backtrack a step here. Got ahead of myself. Write that down below. So when you're taking something to that, finding the nth root is the same thing as raising to the 1/n power. Okay, so we saw that up here with 1/5 power, the 1/6 power, the 1/2 power. So in terms of mathematical symbols, then the nth root of a number is the same thing as taking that number to the 1/n power. All right, so now we have rewriting expression in exponential form, so you don't actually have to solve this. Let's just rewrite it in its exponential form. So we have this being a square root really means that it's 8 to the 1/2 power. Right, this being 3x to the 4th power, and then it's a square root here. That's the same thing as saying 3x to the 4th to the 1/2 power. Okay, so just to be clear here, that this right here is underneath the square root, so it's like the 1/2 power of 3x to the 4th. 50, so if we want to rewrite that, go back to my purple here. If we want to go back to that and say that would be 50 to the 1/5 power. Right? D here, we've got this whole thing underneath the root. So I'm going to just put parentheses around that, put a little 1 outside. So that's the same thing as saying this whole thing, 5abc to the 1/3 power. So 5abc to the 1/3 power. And notice this d was not underneath the root, not being raised to a particular fractional power. And so we'll just write that separately as 5abc to the 1/3 power times d. So you're just practicing rewriting those. Rewriting these expressions in root form. So let's just reverse that then. So let's just write the root. There's that 3. And then underneath we have 5x to that 1st power. So you wouldn't actually have to write the parentheses around that, but I just like to do that. In this case, since the whole 5x is being raised to the 1/3 power, I like to write it that way. All right, next one. Notice this case, the fractional rational exponent is just with the x. So 7 stands outside. 7 is like the coefficient. And then we have x, fifth root. So the fifth root of x, you don't have to write the 1 there if you don't want to, but I'm just going to get into that habit. So the x to the 1 power, we're taking the fifth root. So 7 times the fifth root of x. Same thing on the next one here. Only the x is being raised to the 1/2 power. So 4 is not being raised to the power, so we'll keep that as a coefficient out here. So 4 times x. And remember, the 1/2 power is the same thing as the square root, so you could just leave it like this. If you really want to put a little 1 here and a 2 here, that would also be correct. All right, once again, we have the 1/2 power here, but now notice that the entire 4x is being raised to the 1/2 power. So that means that entire thing, the entire 4x, is underneath the square root symbol here. And you could just leave it like this because it's a square root, which is our standard root, but if you want to write a little 1 and 2 out here, you certainly can. And then our last one, we're going to try to simplify these expressions. So now we're going to kind of combine a couple things together. So let's think about raising this now to the power of rational fractional power. So we have a square root here, which basically means then that 9x to the 4th is being raised to the 1/2 power. So 9x to the 4th to the 1/2. All right, now let's just use our exponent rules that we learned from a few days ago. So that means that both parts are being raised to the 1/2 power. 9 is being raised to the 1/2 power, and then x to the 4th to the 1/2 power. Remember, that's our power to a power rule, 2 powers in a row. Remember, that means that we multiply the powers. 4 times 1/2. In other words, 1/2 of 4 is 2. 4 times 1/2 is 2. So that's going to be 9 to the 1/2 x squared. Let's simplify this just a little bit more. 9 to the 1/2 power is the same thing as taking the square root of 9. So either way, if you know the square root of 9, but if you wanted to use your fractional exponents, your rational exponents, remember that is the same thing as the square root of 9, which is 3. So this final answer simplified would be 3x squared. Let's do the same thing on the next one. So that means that we have actually I don't need to use the root here. So let's just go ahead and straight up with our rules. So that means that 4 is being raised to the 1/2 power, and then x to the 6th to the 1/2. So there's our power to a power rule again. 6 times 1/2, 1/2 of 6 is 3. Remember, this is the same thing as the square root of 4, 4 to the 1/2 power. So that is 2. So 2x cubed would be our simplified final answer. And then the next one here, notice that the 4 is not being raised to the power. So we'll just keep the 4 separate. X to the 6th to the 1/2 is being raised to the 1/2 power though. And so once again, power to a power, 6 times 1/2, half of 6 is 3. So that would be 4x cubed. And there we have it.